My name is Dave, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on decentralized storage for high-censorship environments, co-hosted by TechSoup and Digi-CNX, and supported by an award from the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. So this event is co-organized by Digi-CNX. We are a local Chiang Mai-based network committed to dialogue and research on how digital technologies are impacting people and our planet. We've almost coming on to 2 years now. We've been doing a lot of in-person meetups, and this is our first hybrid event, which is nice, where we've been able to bring in communities from around the world. And we are co-hosted, I would say, in partnership with the School of Public Policy at CMU, and really thinking about how we can build a space here in Chiang Mai, connecting some of the awesome communities that are here to dialogue and research and connect. And we're really lucky to be able to partner with an organization in the US called TechSoup, who Eli will introduce in a moment, and share a little bit more about how this event came about, the intentions behind this program, and then move on from there.
Hi there, friends. I'm Eli. I'm over in Vancouver, Canada, and I have the pleasure of working for TechSoup, which is a nonprofit that gets to help other nonprofits figure out where does technology fit in the delivery of their mission. We're best known for our technology discount and donation program. So if you go to our website, and there's actually a TechSoup in every country basically in the world, but specifically locally, there is also a version. And that's where you can go to find all kinds of interesting offers. Things like Zoom, the product we're using right now, available at a discount for nonprofits and charities. So that's what TechSoup's best known for. But we also partner with organizations like the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web to go deeper into certain technology issues. And one of the things we've seen over the last couple of years is that the people who are holding cultural memory, the archivists, the libraries, the museums, are in this strange place where they're sometimes under threat, where people are actually trying to take down the things that they've created and put up and are trying to archive. Or sometimes they're just like drowning in the cost of storage or looking for best practices. So we put together what we're calling the Cultural Memory Lab. And the goal is to basically help those archivists figure out how can they adopt frontier technologies like the decentralized storage from the D-Web. And so what we've done around that is we put together basically a course, some mentorship, and then these micro grants. That program officially closed on February 2nd, but we're going to hold a couple spots open for the people who've gone to the series of 6 D-Web node events we're doing around the globe. And we'll make sure that because you have basically registered for this event, I'll make sure that you get an email by the end of March with a link inviting you in to the application. It's pretty brief because we're not going to give you $1 million, but it's a couple thousand just to help you along the way. And so this mix of learning, of mentorship, and of money, we think is going to help these organizations who are starting to take a bit of a collection and say, can I take a part of this and do a pilot project? Can I test it by putting some of that into decentralized storage and see how that works for my organization, where I might have some roadblocks and where it might have some benefits. Watch your inboxes. You'll see more about that as we go forward. But the core piece of that is the eligible people are basically people working with a nonprofit or charity, and that can be in partnership or through fiscal sponsorship, who are working on some kind of cultural memory challenge. You should already have a bit of an existing archive. So we think like at least 50 items that you're stewarding. You can be based in pretty much any country in the world. We invite you to do it either as solo or up to a team of 5 people. And you've got to be, as I said, affiliated in some way with a nonprofit or a charitable organization as it's defined in your country. So I think that is the quick overview of the Cultural Memory Lab. As I said, you'll get an email inviting you in to learn more and apply sometime within the next 6-ish weeks.
And with that, I'll introduce our guest speaker today, Adam Rose, who's the COO of Starling Lab, and he sits at a very interesting intersection of not just the technology of decentralized web, but also around media, around journalism, doing some of the work that I think some of us here in the room care about deeply. And I think Adam can share a lot of experiences, case studies that works on Rolling Stones project, which I'm very curious to learn more about as well, and on how we can use this emerging, promising, but still not quite fleshed out, still not quite mature technology for these kinds of use cases. And Adam, I would love to put the floor to you, but before I do that, I would also like everybody else in this group to also share just a quick one line so we know who's here and what everyone's interested in. And then Adam, I'll turn over to you for your presentation. So with that, I'll just pass on the mic, but I want to start with folks. I'll start with everyone here, and then people online, you can get ready. We'll do a quick one-line intro of who you are and why you're interested to be here. Let's keep it short, just under 25 seconds. Cash.
Thank you, Deb. Good morning. I'm Florian Reynolds, the country director of Heinrich Böll Stiftung Myanmar. We are a German nonprofit and work on digital rights also for Myanmar. So that's why this topic today is extremely interesting for us to see what's possible.
Hi, I'm Vaughan. I'm the CTO of a commercial HR company. I've been in Myanmar for about 8 years. Currently building in Web3 using decentralized storage solutions like Internet Computer Protocol and Jackal, which kind of adds encryption on top of decentralized storage.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gaga. I'm from Myanmar Internet Project. We work on digital right, digital security issue, especially in Myanmar. And I'm really interested in this decentralized storage because we need sustainability approach for all the shutdown and other scattered people around the world for Myanmar people.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm Laura Lee. My background is in nonprofit communications and blockchain, and I'm very curious. I love everything decentralized, and we need more and more tools. And so learning how this one can work and what it can do.
I'm Akanit. I'm a PhD scholar at McGill University. I study social movements and human rights, and I'm here because I'm interested in human rights documentation.
What's up, guys? I'm sorry I'm late. I was on the call on Zoom, and now I am here in person. I'm Yuka. I run a nonprofit that does safety and security and protection for journalists, and I run I'm involved in a couple of different civic tech governance projects that it's nice to be acquainted.
I'm Bradley. It's from MIT together with we work on also the communications and digital ecosystem research. This decentralized storage solutions will be beneficial for our target audiences. Very excited to learn more. I'm going to call out him now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ian. I'm from Engage Media. I'm also based in Chiang Mai. Sorry, I couldn't try today in person. And I'm also doing digital security and digital rights for Southeast Asia. I'm currently working for Cambodians and Myanmar. Thank you.
I am Charles, and I'm currently working the digital repression and related digital right violation in Myanmar as part of my role with the Myanmar Internet Project MIB. We are working together with the Brett and Cars. And I'm interested in this decentralization because it empowers individuals and communities to resist oppressive control over information and ensure more equitable access to free expression.
Hi, everyone. Robert Pinto, I'm the author of Life Beyond Thinking, which is really around transforming trauma so people can enjoy life. And that's fundamentally around truth. Unless we get to the truth, we're trapped in a prison of suffering. So I'm very interested in censorship and the difference between decentralization and redundancy, because I think people talk about redundancy and it's not actually decentralized. So I am very curious to see the architecture of this and how it all works.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Darika. So I'm based in Bangkok mostly. So I'm working with Access now for now. And I'm working for the digital security, especially for Southeast Asia, Thailand, and Myanmar, and probably in Mekong countries. And also working on the digital right policy for the advocacy.
Hi, I'm Kyril from Engage Media. So we work on making human rights tech more available to human rights defenders across the region. And I'm here to learn and connect with you all. Anyone else? Sam?
Miss Sam. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Sam, and also I am a former Engage Media, and I am from Myanmar, and now I'm currently working for organization inside Myanmar together with a Bread for the World organization, and I am currently based in Chiang Mai. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you everyone for sharing. It's cool we have so many NGOs, civil society, this region and this part of the world. It's what we wanted to do. And I think we can move into our presentation with Adam.
I will just begin by wanting to express my thanks for everyone joining today and for having me today. I'm really honored because I understand that all of you are doing very important work to preserve culture, to preserve evidence, and to preserve humanity in your own important ways. So I hope that what I share in the next hour or so will assist you in doing that. I am here in Los Angeles presenting on my own with a couple of screens. So if I look around and you're looking at my video, that's why, because I have a few screens here. I also have some cats who may interrupt and say hello, but hopefully not too much of a distraction. In terms of any questions that folks want to ask along the way, if I don't see the chat or anything like that, please don't hesitate to speak up on your microphone or have someone else speak up on your behalf if someone, one of the moderators sees a question. And I'll also try and plan some breaks. I will say that there's a lot to learn and there's so much information. I have given many presentations about this, but I'm trying to cover a very specific set of materials in a very specific amount of time. I may need to skip and adjust. And if people feel that they're getting lost or that they want to move faster, of course, please feel free to chime up and speak up on that. What I really want to frame this conversation as today with all of you is a conversation about the basics. Technologies of all sorts can get very complicated very fast. There's no expectation that you come to the world of decentralized technologies as an engineer. You don't need to know advanced math. You don't need to be able to do a lot of things like that as well to drive a car. You think about that analogy, many of us can drive a car without knowing how to work on the underlying technologies and to know how to change the brakes or make an airbag system work. But we know when we learn about how to drive a car, what the rules of the road are, what the buttons are on the dash, and what the things are we should do to safely navigate the world. In all of that and in all walks of life, it's important to understand the basics. And so I hope today to equip you with that perspective as that stepping stone in your experience with all of the things that you see listed on screen right now. I'm going to do my best to cover not in depth with each one of these things, but the basics. I want to give you a little lesson on why that matters. That's very dear to me. The year was 1965, and the gentleman in the middle of this photo is a man by the name of John Wooden. Some of you might know him, most of you may not, but in this country, he was a very famous figure. This was the coach of the UCLA basketball team. Now, I went to USC. My university lab that I work at today is based jointly at USC and Stanford. UCLA was our sports rival, and obviously, I was not around in 1965. John Wooden won everything. He was the greatest coach of all time in this country in sports. And famously, when he would have all these big players come in, and these were stars, these were young men who felt in charge of the world because they were on their way to becoming very rich and very successful in the National Basketball Association. They were going to be superstars. Many household names in this country came through his program. And on their first day, and these were people who were state champions, they'd won all sorts of awards, he would sit them down on the bench in the locker room, and he would have them take off their shoes and take off their socks. And he would have them put their socks on for him. And he would tell them exactly what they were doing right and exactly what they were doing wrong. And these big 7-foot giants of men would be so flummoxed that this old little man is making them put on their socks. It seemed insulting. But he had a point to all of that it was all about the basics. And as he would explain, as the players would become better at their skills, he was worried they were going to get blisters. And if they got a blister, they would be sitting on the bench and they would not be able to perform for him. Technologies work in some of these same ways, where if we don't get the basics right, and we don't understand the principles of why, even those little things that might seem silly, we can really cause problems. And in high censorship environments in particular, making a mistake can be catastrophic. making a mistake with the basics even more. I was a sports reporter, so I came up that my background is in journalism. I spent 20 years working for the LA Times, Huffington Post, LAist, and CBS. I got to actually meet John Wooden at the end of his life. So famous, this man had a postage stamp in this country that used to honor him, which shows you something about the legacy of that philosophy that he came to with fundamentals. I've also been around many people who've won the Olympics, who've won Super Bowls, and all of the best coaches in this environment always come back to these fundamentals. Quotes like this: if you don't have time to do it right, when will you have time to do it over? While some of the things I described today will be new to you and the technologies might seem a little confusing, to others who might be more advanced at engineering, this will seem very basic, but that's okay. And sometimes we need these reminders. I want to start talking a little bit about Starling Lab and what it is we do. As I mentioned before, we're based jointly at two universities here, Stanford and the University of Southern California. Our specialty as a lab is to authenticate data. So data can mean anything in this day and age. It can mean photo, it can mean video. In the world of deepfakes and generative AI, how can we know anything is real? So we focus on that, and then we focus on preserving it. We do this in three areas. So we talk about applied practice, and these may start to sound familiar to the work that you do. One of those areas from my own background is journalism. So we partner with outlets like Rolling Stone, Reuters, the Associated Press, very large outlets, also very small ones. We're very happy to work with local news outlets, specialty outlets, Inside Climate News, Bay City News, Black Voice News, all of which we've worked with over the last couple of years. Our second practice area is law. And so for some of you, that might be a very important aspect of your work. We think about legal accountability. And the practices that I will describe today have been cited in reports by the United Nations as emerging good practice for documenting war crimes. The last area that we focus on is history. And that really often comes down to archiving. And that's obviously very central to what we're thinking about here today. So in our lab, we work underneath the USC Shoah Foundation. And their job is to preserve the history of genocide survivors, perhaps some crises that you may work on yourself. We have, through USC Shoah Foundation, 57,000 video testimonials from survivors of all sorts of genocides and atrocities around the globe. We put all of these on decentralized storage systems to ensure they're available for generations to come. And to give you a sense of size, because it's hard to think about how large storage can be, those 57,000 video and audio testimonials add up in space to 4 petabytes of storage material. So that's a lot larger than gigabytes and terabytes. We're adding a lot of zeros. It's about 4 million gigabytes, if I'm remembering correctly. I might have the conversion wrong. We have a storage node, a giant set of hard drives at USC, which has 22 petabytes. So that gives you a sense of size of some of these industrial storage solutions. Across the three areas that I've mentioned, I constantly see two types of materials that people want to preserve and archive, especially in areas where there's censorship. The first one is cultural history. The other is evidence. These are often not easy things to work with. And so obviously take precautions. I can't speak to this for you, but about the sensitivities that may be around those. What I've had on screen this whole time is our Starling framework. And we talk about this in a very simplified way of what are the life cycle, or the stages, of the life cycle of data. You capture it, you store it, and you must verify it. And so those three stages are what we focus on in any project. And it always comes back to those three basics. So with the capture portion, there may be portions where we need to add more verification. With the verification aspects, sometimes we need to add more storage. It's okay that these overlap. They aren't strict. But those are the three things that we constantly are thinking about when we apply any sort of technology or tools. And we ask ourselves, how would we design this for authenticity, that we are sure that this is the authentic data that someone will encounter? So that's our lab. That's what we do. And this is what we promote. We focus on this and try and encourage people to think in these terms. What we won't spend a lot of time on today, but I wanted to mention is the importance of good digital security when we're talking about high censorship environments. Now, it's best if you can work with experts who can develop an understanding of, maybe you have a certain threat vector, maybe you have certain risk tolerances, But there are no guarantees in high censorship environments. And so there's a term we often talk about using decentralized technologies to make things tamper-proof. Sometimes that's true, but it's not always. The most important thing is that we make it tamper evident. And that's what I mean about you can't always have a guarantee, but we can ensure that at least, and you know how to react when something perhaps goes wrong, which is obviously the major concern in high censorship environments. While you must assume the worst, you must also live your life. And so at some level, you will be accepting trade-offs when you design your systems for authenticity, when you make your choices about your archives. So those trade-offs, or dilemmas, as we often refer to them, are often between convenience on one hand and security or privacy on the other hand. The way I would describe a way to approach this is to find role models that you look up to who do a really good job at this. The Electronic Frontiers Foundation, marvelous at this. There are other organizations that specialize in these sorts of matters. So while I presented here on screen, and you're welcome to take a screenshot, some examples of things, we're not going to go through all of these, and there's plenty to explain about all of them. But those are some, I wouldn't call them recommendations, but things to consider. These are technologies, philosophies, and approaches to protecting your data. Because ultimately, when there's censorship, if that data is discovered or is at risk in any way, you need to you need to ensure that you have really good digital hygiene. I'll finish my mention of digital security with the idea of being open source. The reason I mentioned one of these things here, actually most of them are probably open source, but an example that I gave of a password manager is Bitwarden, which is open source. For those who are not familiar, really just means that the code is public, and so it can be inspected. If somebody wants to make sure that this is the application it purports to be and that it will function how it's supposed to be functioning, it's really good when you hear that something is open source. But there's two problems that you should be aware of, and this is where I mentioned dilemmas. One is that not always, but sometimes open source projects are not very well supported. And so it's important to find ones that are. Bitwarden, very well supported. If you think about Firefox as a browser, very well supported. The Mozilla Foundation is behind that. But sometimes you'll find things on the internet that will say, we're free, we're open source. Isn't that great? And especially in the DWeb and Web3 communities that we are part of, sometimes things are not well supported. And so it's heartbreaking when they can run out of money or they don't succeed. So you need to be aware of that. And the other thing is this concept of auditing. The reason that to make things open source is that you can audit it. You can look into it and inspect everything. But just because it is open source, it is no guarantee that it has been audited. So when you're talking about adopting certain technologies or certain systems, whether they're a decentralized system or not, it's important, if you do try and find the open source solution, which I encourage you to do, it's important to try and find out who audited this. Is it, in some cases, literally like auditing firms exist. Like in the US, we hear about accounting firms that also do this. In some cases, it's other computer engineers out in the world, even hackers, white hat hackers, people who do that for good. But you want to be thoughtful about that and not just take it for granted that it's the right thing. I want to talk a little bit about the basics of next digitization, because when you're thinking about archiving, this is something that you will encounter. Now, I'm going to mute this and just let it run in the background. There's all sorts of things that you might digitize. In life, we have things that are born digital, obvious when you take a photo on your camera phone, but you also have things that need to be digitized. And so what you see here is an example of one of many kinds of digitization processes. This is a book scanner that is made by the Internet Archive, and they make these available for about $13,000. Now, for some organizations, that's nothing. Now, there's other versions of this that cost over $100,000. For some organizations, that's catastrophically expensive. It is prohibitive. And so you have to understand that there are different needs that different approaches might be right for. And so you might have the technology in your pocket right now. You might pull out a phone if you need to scan and digitize something if it's not already born native. So that's okay. That makes it really easy. The quality might not be as good. Maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not. In the course of this life cycle, the digitization phase for Starling, from our framework's perspective, is what we refer to as capture, in that capture, store, verify model. And whether it's born digital or whether you are digitizing, we like to talk about a root of trust. Now, this can have some very specific meanings to cryptographers, but for us, in a casual sense, what we're talking about is, how do you know that's the real item? what actually what's the reason in this life cycle of information that what gives you that confidence that this is the real thing? And when that happens, do you then have a chain of custody that you can audit and see when that has transitioned down the stream of information, that it is really what you want it to be, the real item, the authentic item? Often in today's internet, when things move downstream, they lose metadata that would have helped you to authenticate. Most common example, you think about when you post a photo on social media. Maybe you are in this cafe today and this morning, and you're sharing with friends that you had a really interesting latte with some latte art on it. That's nice. You certainly don't need to prove that to many people. You don't need authentication evidence. And when your social media platform strips out all the metadata with the location and the date and time, that's really good for your privacy. It's very bad for court evidence. So again, there are these trade-offs and there's these sort of dilemmas. So when you're picking your solutions for when you digitize or when you make a born digital asset, you need to really early on think about, what am I going to collect in terms of the metadata? And how am I going to prove that it's the real metadata? One of the things that's really neat right now, they have new technical standards called C2PA, Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. There are others as well, like hoppers, but the big adopted one right now by the industry out there. So cameras like Leica, Sony, Canon are building this technology on board to help prove the authenticity of the photo, that it's real and hasn't been manipulated by AI. Or many of the AI models out there build C2PA into their data to say, this is AI, and don't let anyone fool you if they try and pass it off as a real photo. If you want to experiment with this, and let's say you're doing digitization and you want to do it for free on your own phone, there's an app called Proof Mode. Do I have it on here? Yes, it's on the slide. Proof Mode is also part of the FFDW Filecoin community. And they use these technologies and they have C2PA on board. So it's a free application you can put on an Android or an iOS phone. And when you take a photo, it adds C2PA metadata to this. We'll talk more in a little bit here about different ways that will become useful. I'll mention that there are real world examples here as well, like a scene, like a place that you're in right now. And we think about VR as the future of a lot of technologies. If I think about a vulnerable place, perhaps it's a temple, perhaps it is a synagogue, perhaps it is a mosque, statues as well, objects that can be destroyed. We are increasingly seeing approaches to scan these in 3D. So they might be destroyed by people who are trying to censor a certain demographic. They might just decay over time or because of weather or any reason. So 3D scanning is another type of way that we digitize the real world around us. And a different kind altogether is what we call web archiving. And this is something I mentioned before, right here with the Internet Archive scanning these books. They also have something called the Wayback Machine, which helps people to save web pages. There are also options out there like archive.today. And the difference between Internet Archive and archive.today, the Internet Archive is a nonprofit based here in California and very well known, very reputable. Archive.today is very good and it actually has some features that are even better, but nobody knows who they are. People have tried for years to figure out who's running archive.today, and we don't know. They could be just a generous person somewhere trying to save the world's information from the web. It could be an intelligence operation from a large country. We just don't know. So when you think about where you might store backups of things like web pages, you might try and print something into a PDF, or you might hit Command S or Control S to save. Or you might try and use one of these services, but you have to think about, do I trust that service to keep it there? Last thing I'll mention on this digitization aspect, or really the capture stage, is that a great tool if you are trying to preserve web pages that are evidence, let's say a social media post with evidence, or culturally significant, is a tool called Web Recorder. And Web Recorder is free. It works with any Chrome-based browser. And it allows you to capture full data, show which servers it came from, and then replay that offline anytime. So we won't spend much more time on this, but just know that you have certain options out there, which, while they're not necessarily decentralized, are very much part of our decentralized world because they have shared philosophies and are participating with a lot of our groups in how we back up and preserve materials. I believe sorry, I'm getting, this is freezing at the moment on my end. So give me just one moment here. I'm trying to unfreeze this. There we go. Unfortunately, it keeps wanting to replay There we go. Great. Okay, something that came up before was the story that Starling did with Rolling Stone. This is a war crimes investigation. Failing in Bosnia 30 years ago in 1992, there were Serbian paramilitary units that went in and were committing atrocities against civilians. And so back then, there was a great photographer by the name of Ron Haviv who took this photo, and it's been slightly covered because it's a graphic photo and we didn't want to disturb anyone in this today. But this shows a purported war crime in progress. And this is a soldier. You can only see him from behind, very callously flicking his cigarette as he's doing terrible things. And in this moment, the photographer thought, I will get justice because I've taken this photo and the world will see. And the world did see. But unfortunately, there has never been accountability. And in fact, for many years, the identity of this soldier was never known. So years later, 30 years later, we teamed up with Ron and helped him to start to preserve this archive. And so as part of this investigation with Rolling Stone, what you see here is the digitization process. This is our capture. And unfortunately, over the course of time, that photo had faced much denialism. People would share it and say, oh, it showed modern day Ukrainian soldiers attacking civilians in Crimea. Or they would make different variations of it online. They would Photoshop different patches on it. It became a point of contention. And even the general of this unit, of this soldier, had denied it when it was handed to him in front of his face. And he denied what was happening in the photo. So Ron was understandably upset that for decades, this reality had been denied. So what you see here is the original film slide that Ron took, and he's putting it into what they call bellows, which is a way of just holding slides that's connected to a digital camera. And we applied a lot of these technologies to ensure that the metadata would show that this was digitized by Ron Haviv himself. So we'll get a little bit more into cryptography soon, but he signed this digitally. And he ensured that it was done correctly and included all of the things that mattered to him, all the metadata, to try and help show that this was a real incident that he had witnessed. You'll notice here that the slide is in paper. And so I'll come back to this in a moment, but notice the white edges of this paper when we put it into the bellows. When I go to this next slide here, we see this archive that was published by Rolling Stone. And this is the first of its kind, where we took an archive of all the evidence, social media posts from modern day, payroll records from the Serbian paramilitary unit 30 years ago, obviously all of the photos that were involved from Ron Haviv. And you see him here in that still in the middle, putting more slides into the system so that we could digitize them and create what we call a cryptographic root of trust. So we actually tethered this camera that you see in front of him. It's a little blurry, but that is tethered to a mobile phone. That mobile phone has what they call a wallet. If you think about cryptocurrencies, it's the exact same thing. And so we were able to use that, to use cryptography to sign this on, and Ron is able to then create these attestations around his work. When you click in this story on any single one of these images or these documents, we have this entire history here of what we call the authentication certificate. And it shows not only metadata, which we manually added, it shows all the places where we use the decentralized web to register and to store. In that storage portion, which we'll be talking more about soon, we have different files networks like IPFS, Filecoin, and storage. You see something spelled STORJ right there. It's pronounced storage. So this, you could go through that story on your own another time, but it's called the DJ and the War Crimes. But this shows how we mapped all of the evidence from this incident and how we saved it in these decentralized ways. What's also really important, I mentioned C2PA a moment ago. You'll want people to not only see what the original photo was, but if you made any changes or whatever the material is that you're digitizing or creating originally. If you think about a photojournalist, they would normally crop a photo. They might color correct. They adjust the sharpness. There's different things like that. They're perfectly permissible. So with Ron's work here, this is another photo from his collection. Because of the way we digitize this, and because we turned on something called content credentials inside of Photoshop, where I personally did the editing on this photo to crop and color correct, it creates an auditable history online of every version of this photo. So you can see right here, that top version of this has this black border around it. Well, think back to when Ron was putting the slide in the bellows, and that piece of paper wouldn't let light through like the actual slide, the film. So that's what it is. And that's what I cropped out in Photoshop. This allows you to audit that. So you don't have to just take my word for it. You can see in the bottom right here that the content credential is issued by Adobe. So they've done all of this, and cryptographically, it would be enormously difficult to hack this. This is a signing certificate which Adobe could revoke if someone did hack it. So the idea is that now we have evidence, and we can even put this in a slider mode. And you might notice it could be hard because of the screen share, but in the sky, it's a slightly different color. And that's because we did very appropriate color correction, but we did make some changes because when you scan it, it's going to be a little bit off. So that's the idea of digitization. That's the idea of a root of trust. And those are the things that we need to do when we first capture these collections. But once we capture it, we must go to that next phase of storage. What I want you to remember, and this is something that has been said for many years, but our professors that we work with and our deans who we work with, they drill this into us. This is one of the basics. Digitization is not the same thing as preservation. And what we're here to talk about is how do we store and archive in high censorship environments. So you have to think very actively about that digitization process. But once you do, you have done nothing yet to preserve it. Digitization is really more about access. Preservation in a digital world is how do we keep this digital material, all these ones and zeros, for as long as we possibly can. The most common approach, and I just pulled this example off the internet for a reason, the most basic version of preservation in a digital world that archivists recommend is called 3-2-1. 3 copies of any file that you make, 2 file formats, and 1 offsite location. So think about where I am in Southern California. We store a lot of our materials at the University of Southern California. We have earthquakes. I'm sure folks may have heard of the big wildfires that almost destroyed major museums here in Los Angeles. So having an offsite location in a very different sort of place is important. I mentioned earlier that I worked for Huffington Post, and I was running the website's front page when Hurricane Sandy hit New York. Our data center that ran our site was in Battery Park. And if anyone is familiar with that hurricane and what happened, very unusual that it flooded Battery Park in New York, in Manhattan. And I was on the phone with our engineers in the night. And I said to them, hey guys, the news reports are coming in that Battery Park is starting to flood, and I know all of our equipment's there. Are we in trouble? And they said, not a problem. Don't worry. We have a backup data center. I said, oh my gosh, this was the first time I'd learned about this idea of backing up in this way. And I said, great. Okay, where is that? And they said, it's in New Jersey. And I said, where in New Jersey? And it was on the other side of the same river. So as the river flooded up and knocked out one of our data centers, it knocked out the other as well. So you really need to think thoughtfully about your backup approaches. And eventually we'll see here why decentralization matters so much. Now, 3-2-1 is the basic approach that we talk about. There's all these other progressions of how might you think about different ways to back up. Are there RAIDs with different digital systems? There's this 3-2-1-1-0 rule. And then there's this idea of centralization, centralization and distributed networks. I don't want you to worry about getting it perfect. The ideal that we dream about in a perfect world is going to be distributed. But we're not there, and it's difficult to get there. But the more you decentralize, the better it will be for the resilience of your material. So we'll spend more time talking about decentralization and distribution soon in this conversation. But what I wanted to flag here first is just the very basic idea of these terms, which you will hear a lot in this space. Centralization tends to mean there is one point of failure. Decentralization means that things are more spread out, but you can still have a point of failure for many nodes. And this chart that you see here comparing these 3 approaches is originally from telecommunications. And the idea maybe of a old phone operator plugging things in. So it's better, it's more resilient, the more decentralized you get. If you get fully distributed, even better. So we'll come back to more of that soon. Let me talk about other things you may consider when you are preserving archives and the way you may have some of your material right now. We have grown up, certainly I did, with all sorts of different types of physical media. And there's some examples here. We have film. And by the way, many digital things, ones and zeros, can be stored on film. So this is photographic film that was the example here on the screen. There's also what we would call LTO, and it's a similar concept. It's magnetic tape. We have hard drives, which are spinning disks of tape often, and then we have flash drives. But there's a problem with all of these. They all decay. Film vinegarizes. If you've ever pulled out an old roll of film and you smell it and something has gone wrong, it may take years, but eventually, often it will vinegarize. You may have a hard drive fail. The parts will break within that. And then you can also have a flash drive fail. Now, these are arbitrary numbers. There's no hard rule. And you might get lucky. A flash drive might work for 50 years. A roll of film might vinegarize in 6 months. But there are patterns to this. And there's all sorts of different studies and conflicting results on how long things might last. Interestingly, there was an institute in Canada that said one of the best storage devices is optical discs or storage mediums. You have CDs, DVDs, really well-preserved ones might last for 200 years, which is a very long time, which is great. You also use it too much, it's going to get scratched. It's not going to last at all. So there are a lot of variables, as you might think about. But one of the problems is as technology has gotten better for storage that we use in our daily lives, things that maybe are not that important, your photo of your latte art, your breakfast on Instagram or something like that. And we're putting that on our phone, which has flash. It's faster, it holds more, and the prices are coming down. But that's all sacrificed with longevity. That's what we've given up. That's the trade-off, is that these get better in many ways, but they are less stable over time. And what if you lose it? Or what if you get a floppy drive and someone hands it to you, or a VHS tape, or a CD-ROM? How many of you actually have a drive to play that in? Many of these technologies, even if they're relatively stable, like an optical disc, like a CD or DVD, if you don't have the right player, you're out of luck. This impacts a lot of people in the real world who are professional documenters, like a photojournalist. What I'm showing on screen right now is a photojournalist collection that we're working with, a gentleman by the name of Christopher Morris. He's documented conflicts all over the world. This is what he specializes in. The photos on the left are from Panama in 1989, and that's when his career really took off. But over the course of years, he's probably documented 15 different war zones, if not more: Bosnia, Chechnya, Croatia, Somalia. In 1993, he switched from film to one of the world's first digital cameras by Nikon. And he started storing things on zip drives. I don't know if anyone even knows what zip drives are anymore. I remember them from when I was a kid. Then he would store things on CD. And he has 1 million images, he estimates, that he has taken in his career, almost all of which are now on the mediums that you see on the right. And these are HDDs, so the spinning disk version, and a few are SSD, which use flash. The ones you see here, he started using in the field in 2010, so about 20-some years ago, 15 years ago. And approximately 20% of his are backed up on other systems, but that means 80% of his career work, 800,000 photos, are on these sorts of disks if he's digitized them at all. These can break. They give you an example. I believe the warranty that they give you, these device manufacturers, they say 3 to 5 years, 5 years on the high end. And you're looking at ones that are 15 years old. So does he have any confidence that his career's collection will be saved? So what is the best way? We'll get there in a second. And I mentioned before that there were disasters, but something else to consider: Christopher Morris, this amazing photographer, the photo highlighted with a little magnifier on it there, that won a World Press Photo Award. The collections that he has in Tampa Bay, Florida, where he lives, were all under great risk last October. And if you followed the news in the US, this probably wasn't as big globally, but we had a very large hurricane called Hurricane Milton that came barreling right down on Tampa. And he had he had a lot more than just the ones on screen. He had all these film slides as well, chromes they called them. And he was putting them in filing cabinets on wheels and using ropes and pulling them up in a ratcheting system to dangle them from his ceilings in case there was flooding. And with what he could, he loaded them onto trucks, pickup trucks, in the rain, in case he had to flee. He got very lucky, and many people there did. The hurricane moved about a few miles, maybe 5, 10, 15 miles to the south. And it avoided this very populated area and still caused much devastation. But I've lived through earthquakes. I've lost my childhood home in an earthquake. I know a photographer here in Los Angeles who lost their home in what they call the Eaton fire last month. So physical storage has all sorts of risks. This now brings us to cloud storage, and beyond just cloud storage, centralized cloud storage, where you trust a provider. And there are risks to this. So this is not to say that your day-to-day photos, your average files are unsafe, but you should be aware of the risks. And I'm going to run quickly through a few of these examples where in the last couple of years, this article was from 2023, Google suddenly had a whole bunch of complaints that files were missing from Google Drive. And to this day, a couple of years later, I have not heard the follow-up from Google or anyone else that these files were ever rediscovered. Very uncommon, right? It's a small percentage, but you don't want to be in that percentage. If these were your only backups, you'd be in trouble. If they were one of your many backups, if you have a 3-2-1 approach to preservation and you use Google Cloud and a decentralized system and you have physical storage, then you would be very confident that one of those would survive. OVH is a cloud storage provider that we use in my day job, day-to-day work. We store extra material there. I don't know why they did this, but they put one of their data centers in a wooden building. Now, I mentioned the storage node that we have at USC with 22 petabytes of space. That is in an advanced concrete building that cannot burn. It's got all these earthquake protections. It's such a silly mistake. OVH is one of the largest data storage companies in Europe. And yet, and they've been doing this for decades, here's the story from 2021. A wooden building full of data went up in flames. I believe most of this was backed up, but it caused all sorts of problems in the interim. There could be other things that aren't natural disaster. And of course, we think about threats in high censorship environments. So ransomware attacks might be done by hackers, but they could also be done by state actors, by governments. So this is an example of a smaller storage provider that was Danish, and they had a ransomware attack. And the people who did this attack and they encrypted all of the data and said, we will not unlock this unless you pay us some huge sum of money. They couldn't afford it. And they shut down the entire company and lost all of the data. I could go on and on. I won't bore you with more examples like that because they get redundant. I just want you to get the point. Let's talk a little bit more about centralization of technologies, that we rely on certain things. And we understandably might rely on Google. Very recent story here. This is from last October. Google announced that their link shortener, where you have these short links there instead of a long 100-letter URL where instead you want something you'd write down on a business card. Their shortening service is being shut down. Starting now, it's pretty much any day now, they're going to start rolling out aspects of this, but you can see on here that it's August 2025 when this will all go away. So if you built web pages or other things that are based on this, what they call content addressing, and this depends on a location, intermediary location, but a location nonetheless, it's all going to break. You'll discover more about, I think in the next session, what we call content addressing, and that's the solution to this that we use in decentralized storage. Another thing with high censorship environments is then when you do have centralized control over the internet and authorities that can create what they call a splinter net, where they create an insular world of their own that only their citizens can access or that they can't access outside of that, then you see entire news publications come down. You have all sorts of ways that censorship is performed. We'll end on some scarier versions of this. Not that this is not scary. This to me worries me that China is starting to what they call erase Hong Kong's memory. Apple Daily has gone under. If you ever need archives though, Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine happens to happen. Also selective editing. And this is what I talk about when we talk about the authentic original version of a web page or a set of data or a video or a photo. If you can authenticate it early on, you can help protect against censorship that might be political. So there's examples here where in China, they've censored TV shows. They're from the US or elsewhere, and they've taken out references to LGBTQ cultures, Russia, North Korea. There's all sorts of ways that things can be censored as a requirement by governments. That's where we see it start to come up in the data. When we think about Tiananmen Square and how few people in China today may understand what happened in Tiananmen Square. Another aspect of centralization, and I will talk always very highly about the Internet Archive, I think. I absolutely adore the work that they do, but they can be attacked as well. And so if you were to only trust the Internet Archive, you may have heard that they had a major hack. And it wasn't just a hack, but also what they call a DOS it's a denial of service attack. And so their site went offline for a period of time. Brewster here, who's in the photo, he's the founder. A few days after that, just a coincidence, I went to a big event at the Internet Archive and I was talking to him, and he said, I don't know why anyone would have done this to us, but why bother? If you really wanted to stop us, you could walk in the front doors that you see behind him in that photo. He said, anyone can walk in and touch our servers. And I'm standing with him right there next to their servers. And it's true. You can walk in and just touch the servers there. Even if you back up a web page, let's say it's a social media post with evidence of a atrocity or a war crime, or it's culturally significant. If you only have that one backup, not enough. So that's why we need 3-2-1 preservation. I'm going to take a little break here, at least to stop and ask if there are questions before we move on to some ideas around cryptography and authenticity.
Oh, we have a question now.
So what someone asked here is, how do you deal with the issue of IP, intellectual property? Case in point is that the Internet Archive lost a very, I think it's still being appealed, but there was a big lawsuit with Hachette, which is a book publisher. And fortunately, the Internet Archive is fairly well funded. And so a lot of people from the outside, I can't speak on their behalf, feel that they're likely to survive this. But that's an example of where, let's say someone sues for copyright infringement, it could go under. There's a very good law review article about this issue, which I wouldn't expect most people to read, and it really only applies in the United States. It was in the Fordham Law Journal on, I think, entertainment and media. It was written by a gentleman named Frank Lamont, Lomonte, if I remember correctly. And Frank happens to be a lawyer for CNN. So he represents this big news network. And the article was with some law students, and they wrote about this is a collection in somewhere in New Jersey or New York, I think Poughkeepsie, of all places. And so it's an out-of-the-way place where a newspaper morgue, they call it, where they keep all their photographs. I think the newspaper was going out of business, and they didn't know who would own all of the material. But there was an effort that was made to preserve all of this. Lawyers are trying to figure out, what do we do about the rights? What do we do about the licensing? I would suggest that you need to do that as part of your risk assessment when you think about digital security, is think about your legal risks for copyright and for intellectual property. But I think that often is not the problem for people in high censorship environments. I think that more often it's a matter of, this is a desperate situation where we are trying to preserve things for future generations. And 40 years from now, people probably aren't going to be worrying about who has the copyright of a sacred text or of war crimes evidence. It's a very important and very good question. I don't mean to dismiss that. But I also think that, at least for many of the people here today, I hope that will not be the primary concern, and that it will not distract from maybe their larger concerns. I want to talk a little bit about basics of cryptography and the basics of authentication as we think about them. And I'm hoping we're going to be okay on time here. Again, this is, for some of you, very basic. For some of you, this is going to be very advanced. But I want to talk a little bit about hashing, which is a lot like fingerprinting. And I want to talk about how we register materials. And then you'll get a sense of how these are applied with these systems very soon here in your next session. I will say that all of this is to authenticate what we call glass to glass. From the moment, let's say it's with a camera, that light hits the lens of a camera, all the way through the time it comes off of your screen or your mobile device, whether it's desktop or mobile. But so in between, everything is ones and zeros, right? It's all digital. And so it's bits and bytes. We can authenticate that. As it says on screen, there's no guarantees. There are ways to hack, but we try and mitigate those. And we've done a lot, at least to make it tamper evident. But also you have to consider, as part of that holistic approach to what we call capture, store, verify, how do you verify it? How do you overcome biases? How do you overcome people denialism, or what they call the liar's dividend? The more you deny something, the more people start to wonder, oh, is that really real? We've actually had examples where real photos in the news people thought were deepfake, and it turns out they were real. They showed disasters. And this was in Spain in particular. I didn't make a slide for this one. But there's this photo of all these cars piled up, and it was a flood, and people didn't think it was real. But you go to the Getty wire service and you see the photos and you see them from different angles, and you realize this was a real incident. But if aid was dependent on that and people didn't believe it had happened, we would have a real problem on our hands. So it's important to remember that human verification as well, people to educate and people to corroborate, are very important. So fingerprints. Basic idea, and this is going to get us into hashing. So fingerprints are used for all sorts of things. They're very convenient. You probably use that or similar for biometric identification, whether it's on your phone, literal fingerprints in criminal matters, all sorts of things. So as an example, I always like to show this and say, whose fingerprint is this? I'm going to keep going because normally I try and do this a little more interactive, but I'm not in the room. These are some famous Americans, and there's no way to tell. You don't know if this fingerprint is from someone who's a man, a woman, black, white. There's nothing. You can't tell their age, their education, nothing at all. But it's still a very unique identifier, and it's a very useful tool when used certain ways. We wouldn't use it in these situations to unlock your device or pay at the grocery store if it revealed too much information. And something else is that you can fingerprint other things in other ways. So in this case, I was actually showing you a koala's fingerprint the entire time. And koalas, different animals, have fingerprints too. But what else could have a fingerprint? In computing, the idea of fingerprinting is called hashing. And you can take any sort of a file. Doesn't matter if it's a phone number that's really short, just a few digits, or it's an entire encyclopedia or video files, and you run it through a hashing algorithm. It's a function. And depends which one you choose, but typically it might spit out about 64 characters in length of a unique identifier. And if you change one number, whether it's in the encyclopedia or the phone number, or you change one pixel in a photo, a completely different hash is generated the next time. In the same way as a fingerprint, it doesn't reveal anything. So if you have private information that you hash, let's say you have information that might be censored, but you later need to prove that it's the original version, you can hash it. And the person who might want to change that, if they censor it, let's say like those TV shows I mentioned before, they remove portions of it, or they dub over it, or they try and alter what happened in Tiananmen Square by photoshopping out the protester and saying, see, they weren't there, this never happened. You run that 1 and 0 set, all the data from that image, from that file, and it's going to produce a different hash. You don't need to ever know, though, how big is the file, what is actually showing it. So there's a lot of useful principles in there. In order to do this, I'm going to gloss over this part, but as you might imagine, every letter corresponds to a bunch of 1s and 0s. So the word koala, your computer is really seeing this string of 1s and 0s. And you can get into the mapping of all of that. But no matter what, that word koala is always going to become in a hash. SHA-256 is the version of hash. And they have a few different formulas. We tend to use SHA-256. That's the name of the formula. And it's free. Anyone can use it. This is always going to be what the word koala looks like when you run it through the hash. When you take the entire volume of War and Peace, a very long book, 1,200 pages long, it also comes out as a hash, just 64 characters. You can think about how easy that is. You could write that down on a cocktail napkin. You could read it to someone over the phone. You can write it on a business card. Coming back again, in terms of that privacy, that very first hash I showed you, you don't know what it is. This being the presentation it was a koala, of course. And so it's this photo that I found on the internet of a koala, and I hashed it, and it becomes this. So 2 different koala photos, 2 very different hashes, right? They don't have any relationship to each other, and you can't tell much about them. Again, throughout all of this, I'm using a hashing formula called SHA-256. Now, if I put the same photo in twice, I get the same hash twice. If you change 1 pixel, like I said, now these are completely mismatched. Anyone in the room looking at this, you cannot tell what the difference is in these photos. But I guarantee you that 1 pixel has been changed. So there's a little red dot that I put on his nose in Photoshop. Other than that, it's identical. This is extremely useful for not just for security reasons, but also for what they might call a checksum. There are other more lightweight versions of doing a checksum that folks may worry about, but you know that if you have the matching data 100 years from now, someone hands you the data and says, this was the original, whether it's a PDF that shows evidence of someone's birth date, like a birth certificate, or whether it's a confessions video, you can prove that it was the original. So yeah, this gives some other examples here. Let's say that you're trying to bring a hard drive with material through a checkpoint, through a border crossing, and someone then manipulates that data because let's say the border crossing agents take that material from you. You might then want to run it back through a hash on the other end to make sure that no one has manipulated your device while it was in their custody. Often they'll take it, they'll try and scan it, right? And so if you've encrypted it, that's one thing that keeps it hopefully safe, but maybe they deleted certain files or something. You can tell that it's all there. So all of these are great ways of using hashing. This is one of what they call the most basic primitives of cryptography. In cryptography, most of us think about how we keep things secret, but there's some other cool stuff that cryptography can do like this. So then we get into this idea of registration. And this is the idea of us when we register something is to prove that it existed the whole time. So we want to register this hash somewhere, right? You could, as I said, you can write it on a cocktail napkin, but you're going to lose that eventually. So we register all sorts of things with all sorts of metadata, patents, birth certificates. We use notaries. It's a very common process in the real world. And there's different versions that you can think about, whether it's the ones I mentioned, but then increasingly they start to decentralize. When you have creative works in the US, we go and register them with the Library of Congress, or books. There's a private agency called the Bowker Agency, which has all of those ISBN numbers. If you look at the number on any book with a barcode, it's called an ISBN. Well, that's centralized. Increasingly, we want to decentralize things. If you think about a notary, someone whose job it is, they're registered by the state and they put a seal on it and they write in their log that this has been preserved. Those are more decentralized. In the US alone, we have 4.4 million people who are notaries. Blockchain is ideally the most decentralized version of how we register information. One of the very first ways, what we call the first blockchain with a link, was in a newspaper, and in a classified ad, someone took a hash of something and they put it in the newspaper as a classified ad, knowing that would be distributed to libraries and saved in all these libraries, knowing it would be saved all over the world. It was actually in the New York Times in 1995 when we had the first informal blockchain. A blockchain often gets hyped up because of cryptocurrencies and things like that, but it's very useful. All a blockchain is a ledger, and we use it to store information. What's unique about this is that you then have copies of that blockchain stored all over the world. It's really important to know something if you're not familiar with blockchain. And this is where people often get confused. People talk about storing data on blockchain. And the average person will often think, oh, if I have a video, it's now saved on blockchain. That is not the case. All blockchains do is take very small amounts usually. It would be very expensive to take your video file and store it on 10,000 servers around the globe. That's going to get expensive. So instead, it's storing the hash or some variation. We'll get into ideas like content addressing and content IDs, things like that. But that's basically the idea behind all of this. It's very functional. And that's the whole idea of this authentication. Now, we'll get more into storage in just a moment here, but I wanted to take a break and see if there were any questions about that, especially because I figured I might have to run through that pretty quickly.
You just said one of the key things about blockchain that I've always asked people and no one's been able to answer, so I'm going to put you on the spot. It says blockchain just records that it was there. It doesn't say that it was true. Yes. And I hear constantly people saying, oh, blockchain is decentralized, it's decentralized. But in my mind, it's just hyper redundant. So if a lie gets into the system, who's to say it's not a lie? It's back to the same problem. And no one's been able to answer that.
So I'm very glad. This is a question I deal with every day, and it's a very good one. And often there's so much hype around blockchain. And I want to be very clear about this. I do not buy into the hype. I want to be very clear about very specialized use cases, right? It can do things, but there's other things it cannot do. Blockchain can prove something existed at a point in time. It cannot prove, or sorry, I should say, what it can prove is that is valid, that it lived in that point in time. It proved that transactions existed, which is why it's so useful for currencies and in finance. And I get why people do that. They need to prove that a transaction someone has hashed, registered, that really happened. And you can then go back and audit that. And if people make it available in certain contexts, it makes sense. And I'm not a cryptocurrency type. I'm not into NFT trading. I don't have any cryptocurrency. But I understand why people would use it that way. This technology cannot dictate, it cannot arbitrate what is true and what is false. It can do something else. It can establish trust that some claim existed at a certain point in time. That's it. So that is valuable, but it's not as valuable as people sometimes sell it to be. That's why when we talk about at Starling Lab, capture, store, and verify, we talk about the authentication approaches and the standards like C2PA that I mentioned earlier. And what that is doing is using the cryptography on device ideally. So whether it's the hardware, which is what's best, or often like proof mode runs on the software of your phone, it's able to create a signature that is an attestation. When we collect a lot of multiple attestations, we start to get a consensus system where people are saying, oh, this could be real. if you have people you trust vouching for it and they've signed it, and it works a lot like a real signature, but it's actually a little more secure. If an entity you trust signs it, that's a really good sign. Indication. If you don't have anyone who exists and you don't understand these technologies at all, there's obviously reasons why you might not trust that. So it is not perfect. There are going to be trade-offs. However, I personally feel very secure in the cryptography behind that, meaning I don't think that when used correctly that it can be hacked with today's technologies. There are ideas of what they call the post-quantum world, when quantum computing comes into play. So if you had something that was like a SHA-based approach, I mentioned we use SHA-256. Most people I talk to who know more than I do seem confident in SHA-256 not getting hacked once quantum computing exists more widely. Other versions are less secure. And so that's why we default to that one. So the idea of registration is not going to, let's say you have a birth certificate, right? And you have your birth certificate and you say, see, I have this. This proves that I exist. How do you know that piece of paper is the person standing next to you? You can never remove the human from the verification process. So when I talked about the glass to glass process earlier, when you start on that end, when light hits the sensor or the lens, you also need ideally to put witnesses around it who can corroborate that. So like the photo with Ron Haviv that I showed earlier, where he's putting it in the bellows, we have video with that, where he is on camera testifying that he took these photos. Where was he? When were these photos taken? And it matches all of these other things. The idea is that it would allow an investigator to verify that these things are real. That's what I also mean by the idea of this being tamper evident as opposed to tamper proof. There are always going to be ways to try and manipulate something. But if we can improve our understanding of what we can trust, I think that we're a lot better off than we were before. So I hope, it's not a perfect answer, but I hope it maybe gives some context to that. I'm very happy to answer more questions on that before I move on, or any other related questions. Hearing none, I'm going to move ahead here, and I'm going to try and leave a couple minutes at the end for a couple more questions. So I want to talk a little bit more about decentralization and storage specifically. We've shown this photo before, and those dots represent nodes. In the computing world, you can have all sorts of different dots in all sorts of different ways. It can be these giant servers like I showed you that burned down in France. It could be the giant one that we have at USC. This was the first web server. And if you zoom into that very worn out sticker, someone wrote, "This machine is a server, do not power down," because it was a personal computer. Your phone can serve as a node on a storage network. Not going to have a lot of storage, but it can be there. So some of the ideas of this is that we can, let's say, take a file and store a copy fully encrypted. And that's the important thing, is that it doesn't give up your privacy. So we've talked about Filecoin already, and people sometimes describe it like the area of storage. You could, whether it's a phone, whether it's a 20 petabyte server rack, you can make your storage available for people to access. They use a blockchain to verify, and they use this every 24 hours. They check if you are promising to store data, which is fully encrypted, so you don't even know what it is that you're storing, but you get paid for it, like an Airbnb. Every 24 hours, they run what's called a proof of space time. So it is using the math to show that you have stored that material for 24 hours in a certain amount of size, and that it's the original data and that it hasn't been manipulated. So that's where the hashing comes in really handy. I've discussed a bit of this already. Originally, cryptography, which, by the way, goes back to ancient Egypt. This is not like a new fandangled thing, obviously. This goes back a long time. Most of us think about the idea of protection, but it also authenticates. And when we talk about cryptography and we talk about blockchain, all that hype comes down to what we call the top of the stack, where people are talking about payments and crypto assets. But what we are talking about here today is crypto utility. And so it's a lot more boring. It's not as exciting, but it's really important. And it can do a lot more than what we're talking about today, because we're talking about storage. Addressing means content addressing. And what you'll hear more about, I think, in the next session, but I'll briefly mention today. When you go to a website, you might type in something into your browser bar that's the site name .com/ and then a few characters / another, and those are directories. And if you change one thing in there, it breaks. And then all of a sudden it can't find the web page you wanted. The idea of content addressing is that it hashes it. and it takes a hash and it runs it through a different thing that spits out similar idea, what's called a content ID or CID. And when you participate in a decentralized storage network where it might not keep your whole file in one place, it might send it all over the world, right? You can set your choices on this, and depending on which systems you use. So it's now what they call sharded. And shards are scattered. It could be in Vietnam, Thailand, China, or you could say no to China. You could geofence it out. It might be in the US and Mexico. It might be in Europe. It could be in South Africa or Saudi Arabia. You then, the content ID, you recall it, and it looks for all these pieces. It reconstitutes it. It checks, it does a checksum, which could be a hash, and it makes sure your whole file is there. So that's the idea of doing this in a fully distributed way, or at least the more decentralized we get, potentially the better, the more resilient. And the harder it is for someone to censor it when it's encrypted, they don't know what it is, and they can't really find it as easily without knowing the original CID that you have. I think it's self-evident to think about the risks of failure with, as we've already gone through some examples, when we trust these large companies. The principles behind these approaches is that it makes it harder to destroy. Also, when you have distributed processing, which is a part of this ecosystem as well, it makes it harder to corrupt. I want to end talking about some other dilemmas that we face. One of the things that you should think about, let's say you're in a country that is high censorship. The appearance of certain things on your phone can cause alarm. So if a border agent goes through your phone and sees that there's a certain app there, it might set off alarm bells. So you have to make very careful choices in high censorship environments. And most of them, because it's not as widely adopted yet, won't know a lot about these decentralized services like we've talked about, ones that maybe ride on Filecoin or Arweave or storage, IPFS. But they'll ask one of their coworkers who knows about. And so you have to be thoughtful about that, crossing borders in particular. The reason I show this right here with North Korea, they have a phone. It's the only phone, in my understanding, this may have changed in recent years, but in 2013, they released, I'm going to badly mispronounce this, so I apologize. I think it's called the Arirang phone. It was probably a Chinese phone that they just rebranded. And there's a signature system in this. If you receive content that does not match their database of signatures and hashes, essentially, of this content, or if it could fall into a banned list and it can then be blocked from your phone, so you never see it. Someone could, like, obviously there's the joke about Winnie the Pooh and Kim, or sorry, no, that's China. But it could be anything they don't want someone to see. They can block it on the phones that way. And so they have whitelists and blacklists for certain types of content. These are the same principles and same technologies. And so when you make choices, understand that these technologies are not inherently good. They're not inherently bad, but they're not neutral. And so they can be used in any number of ways, including ways that we might worry about. If you want to really dig into the ethics of this and the different types of dilemmas, I highly recommend a report. It was written a few years ago, 2019, from a group called Witness. And very briefly on screen, I'm showing a few of what they call their dilemmas. And it's 14 dilemmas. The report is called TICS, T-I-C-K-S, as in like a checkbox. And it says it's TICS or it didn't happen. So we don't have time to get into the details of it, but I highly recommend that. As I wrap up, I want to take you back to this story that we started with. So this is John Wooden. And we began today talking about 1965 and the basics. 4 years after that, Coach John Wooden had won another 4 national championships. And one of his most famous players from the year I started with this talk, 1965, who was a freshman then, had won all these championships for him, 3 of those 4. His name was Lou Alcindor, and he became an activist. And he took very brave stances that some of you might appreciate. He joined in support of Muhammad Ali in protesting U.S. actions in Vietnam. He refused to go to the Olympics. He would have been a gold medalist, almost guaranteed. The team won without him, and he would have been the best player on it, to protest mistreatment of African Americans in this country. So he gave up a certain gold medal. He also converted to Islam, and he changed his legal name to one you might recognize, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar went on to arguably, certainly for decades, be considered the greatest basketball player in history. A celebrity beyond comparison in this country for a very long time. And you see him here on the left with his coach when he was a young man, a teenager at UCLA. And then you see him when they were old and they remained best friends forever. I've met Kareem, and he to this day, decades later, still tells the story about the socks. He keeps giving that reminder. So 1969, when I think this photo on the left was taken, at UCLA, just down the street from where I am, a researcher sent the very first internet message ever. It was part of ARPA, or the DARPA program. It didn't work very well. Only 2 characters, LO, made it through over this first version of the internet. But they were pioneers, and they had a vision for how the internet was supposed to work. And it started right there. They did not dream that it would be controlled by centralized corporations. They designed that internet to be centralized, to run over nodes, to route and reroute messages so that they could bring humanity closer together. I've just shared where the first internet message came from, but what's also really interesting is where it went. This right here is Douglas Engelbart. And if you want to Google this, he has this amazing demonstration called the mother of all demos. So if you've ever been in a tech thing and people do a demo, the message went, I don't think it went to him personally, but it went to the Stanford Research Institute where he worked. And he was one of the founders of this whole world of decentralization. And so if you find the mother of all demos, it's amazing. In 1968, he'd already invented Zoom, what we're doing right now with the video, showing things on screen. He invented the mouse. He invented the GUI, as I remember correctly. Maybe that was something else at Xerox PARC, but he invented so many of these technologies, and they're in this demo from 1968. Think about how long ago that was, and think about what we had in the 90s. There was nothing like that. The idea, these guys were so smart. They created the internet to be decentralized and to work on the principles that we're talking about here. This article is from 1971, I believe. It was in a magazine called Innovation, and it's called Toward the Decentralized Intellectual Workshop. That is the dream of the people who invented the internet. It's supposed to be decentralized. We don't have time, unfortunately, to actually watch this in these highlights here, but it is on YouTube. And I encourage I encourage everyone to find that and to also understand history. And I'll end on that because many of you are archiving and you're trying to preserve history in these high censorship environments. It's so important that we think about the history of these technologies and everything I told you, blockchain, cryptography, all these things that sound like to some people, oh, these are these newfangled schemes. The good uses of these are still pertinent and always have been, even back to the 1960s where it all started, back with the basics. And of course, my contact info and more links about the lab are available on screen if they help.
Thank you so much, Adam. There was a lot of details, and your presentation is almost like an archive. There's so much of what you probably done in the past. It comes through in everything you speak and everything you shared. So constantly. Yeah, questions. I know we have a very diverse group here of people who are doing kinds of archiving in sometimes very sensitive environments. This is a chance, I think, to use Adam while we have him to maybe share a question or a comment or something you would like to dive into further.
I've got a comment, if that's all right.
Please.
If it's Robert here, I think about this stuff a lot and more from the human point of view. And ultimately, every human lies. Like we all lie. So we're also preserving lies. And history is written by the victor. And I guess it's a bit of a circular thing, but John Wooden, I'm a huge fan of as well. And Wooden had a thing called a rule of 6, which is never lie, never cheat, never lie, never cheat, never steal, no whining, no complaining, no excuses. And I often think if we just did the first one, if everyone stopped lying, we wouldn't need any of this. And it's just more of a comment and observation because there's such low levels of trust in the world. Like just because Adobe authenticates something, that means nothing to me. YouTube, Google, Amazon changed a Star Wars movie from 30 years ago. Like you watch it now and it's got something different in it. So you just, trust is the key thing. So anyway, I don't know. There's no real point apart from stop lying.
If I could share off of that, because I thank you for that. I agree with everything you've said. I wouldn't trust Adobe or Google or anyone else out of the gate, but I would be willing to check their math. There's a phrase, trust but verify. And I think that there are ways that we can verify a lot of this material. I can't do the cryptography myself, but I go to cryptographers who I do trust to try and get their ideas from that. So the term I would encourage people to think about is the idea of a trust proxy. Who do you put your trust in when you aren't sure who to trust? Be careful with those trust proxies. I think that's the lesson there, is that you don't want to just give those out willy-nilly. I'll also add one other example that's funny to think about. One of the least trusted entities, certainly I would hope in this country and probably globally, is the NSA, the National Security Administration. People think about the spying that our country does, that the United States does on everyone else, and it's done by the NSA. The NSA are the best at computer security. They're the best at cryptography. And they helped to create things like SHA-256. Those are actually standards that came from them, which their first reaction should be, I hope it is, wait, why should I trust SHA-256? Couldn't they have put in a back door? Wouldn't we question that even more because we don't trust the NSA? Here's the thing that gives me hope in this. The NSA needs to have security that works against its worst adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea. It doesn't matter who it is. They need bulletproof encryption. They need bulletproof cryptography. And if it didn't work, they wouldn't be using it. They're using it. So if they are willing to use those things in the face of their biggest state adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea, whomever else, they are in the same boat as everyone else. So while there might be good reason not to trust them overall, the shared development, and of course it is open source, so academics all over the world have tried to test it and break it and done their best. So that's another way to think about trust as well, is also what does the least trusted entity need? And when we think about consensus mechanisms on this, we talk about how the most ideal system is actually where you have rivals who have to agree that the cryptography is right. So if you had something that was hashed and then that hash is registered on a blockchain, and you have, just as a hypothetical, sort of very simplified example, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, part of the Five Eyes, as they call it for security, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, all these others who are typically seen as rivals. If they all agree that the cryptography is correct and that a hash algorithm works and the hash is what it purports to be and that the blockchain is, as a consensus, verified, we can put a lot of trust in that. And the more rivalrous it is, better. Now, these are consensus systems when we talk about blockchains. So then the question becomes, well, what, if it's a voting thing and you need 50% plus one, what happens if someone gets to 50% plus one? That's why we need, in these systems, the most distributed version that we can get. The more we go beyond just decentralization into full distribution, the safer these systems are. But you're right to question it.
Yep. Just a quick comment, just that might be interesting to people here. Advances in blockchain technology, there's a project called Internet Computer Protocol that allows you to store 1 gigabyte of data on the blockchain for $5 a year. So that project is where we can actually host websites on the blockchain, which is much more than storing hashes on Ethereum or something like that. And I do think the work that you guys are doing here, having good data stored, is also applicable in newer technologies like AI, where if we're able to have truth-seeking AI, whatever you guys are doing, putting this data is very important. So it's just quick comments.
I do want to say that I think here in this group, we have folks who are trying to archive really important developments, pictures, all kinds of media information as well, from either it's in Myanmar or there's an ongoing civil war, or also in other contexts here. And I wonder if there's any suggestions, any sort of next steps that Adam, you might suggest to folks such as this, who may not even be journalists, but they may be researchers, they may be activists, things that they maybe can start doing. I know you already gave us a very foundational 101 at the start. Any suggestions that you might have for them as they start to maybe thinking about how to start to get on the D-Web for some of their archiving?
So I thought I had some slides with the storage options, but I'm going to mention them again. So I've mentioned IPFS, Arweave, ARWEAVE, Filecoin, and storage, STORJ. Those are different options in terms of decentralized storage systems and storage networks. Sometimes people are storage providers who build off of them. There's different approaches to that. So if you're looking for like a consumer solution, I would start by looking into those four. IPFS and Filecoin are very much interoperable, so that's almost one bucket. But they work. Filecoin's a little more commercialized. IPFS is more of a general thing. You have to do what they call pinning to make sure that your data is saved for the long term on there. But it does make it available that anyone can back it up. And as an act of participation in a civil society, some people do try and help support on preserving certain or pinning certain types of data. I would also look at tools that are in that adjacent space within the DWeb community. So a few that I mentioned, things that are easy for people to use. Proof Mode as an app on your phone. Numbers Capture is another app that you can use for photography. Web Recorder is in this community as well. And with Web Recorder, you can also use something called browser tricks to do things that are more like remote cloud-based storage of web pages. So those are some of the tools that we often are experimenting with and using in our projects here at Starling Lab, which are especially useful for journalists. Let's say you go to a private group on social media that's not available, so the Internet Archive can't record it, so that the archive.today even can't scrape it. What you can do is use Web Recorder to capture that information. And so it will show more information about where it came from, and it's a more reliable sense of preserving that social media evidence. And you go on Telegram sites, and we've done that at scale. We did a project with the DFR lab from the Atlantic Council and saved 10,000 pages of Russian mis and disinformation about the invasion of Ukraine. We have, for various projects, pulled in Ukraine Telegram posts as evidence using Web Recorder. So those are tools that can be fairly effective. We then have turned to a lot of these as what they call cold storage. And maybe that's something I think I didn't really get into that folks should be aware of, is this idea of cold storage as opposed to more hot storage. If you're doing this commercially, you might think of Glacier from Amazon as a cold storage option. It's a little bit larger, cheaper, slower. You're paying actually by the amount that once you ingress, upload that data, you pay for the egress to take it out. And it's a little slower to access. It is not what you're going to need off of your Google Drive necessarily. So as you explore some of those solutions that I mentioned, think whether this is a cold storage solution for you or whether it's the hot storage solution that you're more quickly able to access for your day-to-day needs.
I just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you again, Adam, for sharing your deep wealth of knowledge and expertise. And yeah, from the intros, you all are doing some very fascinating, interesting, important work. And I'd love to continue those discussions to figure out where some of these ideas may support the missions you're all working on.
Lovely. So with that, I think the folks will be joining online. If you've got the survey link, that's awesome. We'll also send it as a follow-up on email along with the video recording. And we'll have the second follow-up on Tuesday. Thank you again, Adam. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm sure we'll play back that many times. And thanks for all the resources and everything.
Thank you all. And I hope anyone feel free to reach out anytime. I left my contact information up earlier.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening or rest of the day.